The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Houses of Parliament sound. 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 Houses of Parliament sound.
Captured the public consciousness and cannot, indeed must not, be ignored by politicians. And what a natural environment this petition refers to. The Amazon rainforest, 5.5 million square kilometres of rainforest surrounding the Amazon River. 60% of it is contained in Brazil, as the honourable member has drawn attention to. And it's home to about a quarter of the world's species, accounts for about 15% of terrestrial photosynthesis, and is a major carbon sink. The World Wildlife Fund report that it's home to perhaps 34 million people, including 385 indigenous groups. It's integral to not just the habitats of the people, plants and animals it provides a home to, but to the global ecosystem. So it's very, very precious. But we also know that the Amazon rainforest has been under threat from deforestation for some years. And between 2001 and 18, Brazil lost almost 55 million hectares of tree cover. That's a staggering amount. Very happy to give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree with me that the word lost makes it sound like it was a bit of an accident, like losing your specs down the back of the sofa, whereas in actual fact what's happened, particularly recently, is that these are the deliberate actions of President Bolsonaro, who wants to basically open up more and more of the Amazon rainforest. And would he agree with me that we should not be entering trade talks with Bolsonaro unless and until he upholds strong environmental standards and stops this action in the Amazon?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She has provided a very short and precise synthesis of my entire speech, but I'm afraid I'm going to continue with it anyway. But she makes an absolutely important point, and the idea that it is lost, you are right. It is perhaps not the right way to put it.
Before he moves on, just not to interrupt his
I'm very happy to give way to my honourable friend.
Would my honourable friend agree with me if any of us listened to the Environment Minister from Brazil on the World Service this morning? I don't know if his heart sunk, but mine did, in terms of the failure to answer any of the questions that he is addressing to the Bolsonaro regime in his speech.
I'm grateful. He's absolutely right. I didn't hear the particular exchange. Of course, it's not uncommon in the political arena for questions not always to be directly answered. But the failure to act, and this is the point I'll be developing in my speech, the failure to act is devastating and very, very dangerous. Let me just return to the 55 million hectares of tree cover, because Mrs. Moon, not everyone knows what 55 million hectares looks like. I'm reliably informed that it translates to a rate of 5.7 football pitches per minute being lost. That is something I can envisage. It is staggering that so many football pitches have been lost just in the time that we've been speaking during this debate. Now, this is not a new problem. We've known it's a problem for some time, and previous Brazilian governments have tried to reduce the level of deforestation through a number of measures which have indeed slowed the rate. and in 2012, Brazil recorded its lowest deforestation rate in the last 20 years. However, this has been reversed this year. A New Scientist reported in July that more than 3,700 square kilometres of forest has been deforested this year alone. And according to preliminary satellite data, the losses for the first 7 months of 2019 are 16% higher than the high of 3,183 square kilometres in 2016. There was an 88% increase in deforestation in June 2019 compared to June 2018. Now, these numbers are startling and worrying, and understandably provoke strong and passionate responses from people across the world. Certainly happy to give way.
Congratulations on calling this an extremely important debate. I apologise for missed the first few moments of his speech. He is, of course, right to call attention to the vast increase in deforestation that's occurred this year. But it's also right to put that in the context of, as he was mentioning in passing, I think, the very significant reduction in deforestation. As recently as 2004, it was 10,500 million square miles a year. Now, last year was 4,000. This year, as he correctly mentioned, it's come back up again. But it's quite right to say that the Brazilian government has been doing their best, albeit this year there seems to be an extremely worrying reversal in it.
I'm grateful the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point. There has been progress. The problem is that something has happened, and that is what I'm going to come on to. And the threat of natural loss as a consequence of these changes is very real and is underway. But it's the political situation that underpins this issue that deserves careful, considered attention. Because exactly as just been pointed out, something has changed. And I have to say, Mrs. Moon, it's hard not to conclude that the environmental damage is a direct consequence of a change in policy direction and in political attitudes, which does bring me to President Bolsonaro. Clearly a controversial figure. I have to say, by no means the only controversial figure on the world stage at the moment. But his attitude to climate change is worth highlighting. Because back in December 2018 at COP24, the Brazilian government promised that their carbon emissions would decrease by 37% by 2025 and by 43% in 2030 compared to 2005 levels. However, since President Bolsonaro took office in January, there has been a clear change. He is widely considered sceptical of actions to curb climate change, and in his election campaign, he said he'd be taking Brazil out of the Paris Climate Change Accord, a note, I fear, from the Trump playbook. But he has then backpedaled a little and has argued that he may not do that so long as Brazil's control over the Amazon remained intact. I have to say, Mrs. Moon, I do not think these should be issues to be negotiated. We should all be working to preserve such an important part of our environment. And then this summer, the world has watched on with huge anxiety as forest fires burned in the Amazon, with many attributing blame to forest clearance policies. The Rainforest Alliance say that satellite data shows an 84% increase in fires compared to the same period in 2018. Now, the Brazilian government denies a causal link, but the disagreement has led to fierce international controversy. And at the UN recently, it was reported that, and I quote, Bolsonaro has launched a cantankerous and conspiratorial defence of his environmental record, blaming Emmanuel Macron and, quote, the deceitful media for hyping this year's fires in the Amazon. And in a combative 30-minute address to the UN General Assembly, Bolsonaro denied, contrary to the evidence, that the world's largest rainforest was being devastated or consumed by fire, as the media deceitfully says, he said. Similarly, in our country, the Guardian newspaper has reported that Bolsonaro is set to unveil draft legislation that would allow commercial mining in indigenous territories, something currently outlawed, despite overwhelming opposition from voters. Now, there are clearly differences of view, but I personally find it hard not to conclude that the pro-development agenda of the Brazilian president is having a clear and dangerous impact, and that the clearing of the rainforest will indeed be used to allow further development of mining and agriculture. So if we are to conclude that there is an issue here, and one on which, because of the global climate impact, we all have an interest, the question becomes, what do we do? Now, the petition calls for trade sanctions, a measure that so far the government here has not adopted or advocated. Indeed, in the government's response to the petition, they state that, and I quote, the United Kingdom shares concerns about deforestation in the Amazon rainforest and the severe impacts on the climate, biodiversity and livelihoods. However, key to tackling these issues is to work with Brazil to find solutions rather than imposing sanctions. I'm afraid, Mrs. Moon, I have to characterise that as a do-nothing response, or rather a do a tiny little bit to maybe give us some cover response, because the government has also stated that, quote, in response to the recent forest fires, the Prime Minister pledged a further £10 million at the G7 summit on the 25th of August. This contribution is an expansion of an existing project, Partnerships for Forests. Now, the rainforest is burning, and frankly, the PM's offered a water pistol. Maybe he could have sent an unused water cannon. Remember the scale of the challenge we face. Government actions hardly equate to, quote, the rapid, unprecedented and far-reaching transitions. Rapid, unprecedented, far-reaching transitions. That was what was called for by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their report last year.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. I think he's making an excellent speech. And I just wanted to ask whether he thinks that the UK actually has a very critical and special responsibility in this area, given that NGOs like Global Witness have shown that actually much of this deforestation has been backed by companies which often have operations in the City of London, and therefore we really should be taking more responsibility about this rather than trying to pretend that it's something that's just affecting a country many, many miles away from us here.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and she makes an important point, and of course it's part of the wider context of Britain's role on the global stage, and I would argue that we are shamefully withdrawing from our positions of influence on the global stage, but we remain important in terms of many of our major companies, and we should be using that influence and that position of authority.
Will my honourable friend give way on a
Happy
related
to.
point? I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Does he also agree with me that this is also in the context of us approaching a very dangerous tipping point in terms of climate change, and that the wider world faces catastrophic climate change if urgent action isn't taken, and that action needs to include stopping deforestation, radical action in the Western world to reduce consumption of meat, other intervention by governments in markets?
Once again, I'm grateful, and indeed this is the important point, this sense of urgency. And of course, this Parliament has declared a climate emergency, although I have to say you would not necessarily guess it from government actions, and it's actions that actually count. And what a marked contrast our government's feeble response is in relation to others, because our European partners have called for trade sanctions. Austrian MPs demanding their government vetoes the EU's proposed trade deal with South America's economic bloc, currently composed of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay. Now, within that, there were also concerns about workers' rights, absolutely correct, but the environmental reasons are paramount, and we've had similar concerns voiced by countries such as France, Ireland and Luxembourg. Now, having been critical government, let me just add a rider, because we are a country that's had an imperial colonising past, and the criticism can always be levelled that while we industrialised and polluted, it's somewhat hypocritical to blame others following along for doing the same. Brazil could argue that as a post-colonial industrial country, it should have the chance to develop its economy, as was done in the UK and by other European countries in the past, and they can certainly point to our lack of environmental concern during that process. And those sympathetic to Bolsonaro's argument could point to data indicating that Brazil has historically contributed to only around 1% of the global emissions since the start of the industrial age. And to criticise other countries for pursuing industrial development from some kind of perspective that we benefited from that kind of approach, but now we know more about it, so you shouldn't put your economy first, is a poor argument. But I would say in return that I believe it's possible to develop the economy in a much more sustainable way if it is not just driven by short-term profit maximisation. And that, I would suggest, is the answer to that conundrum. And I believe that the way forward is through international agreements signed up to by the countries involved to secure that better future approach. There are economic avenues that could be pursued more sustainably, future-proofing Brazil's industry, while maintaining environmental protections and regulations. And many would argue that there is no need for the self-inflicted harm that we've seen, and Greenpeace tell us that, and I quote, Indigenous groups across Brazil are calling for global support to protect their rights and their struggle to safeguard the forests they have inhabited for centuries, and argue that in Brazil, environmental governance bodies have been dismantled and weakened. For instance, the Climate Change and Forests Office and the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change have been closed, which has impacted policies and deforestation prevention, as well as resourcing issues. And Minister Salles has slashed the budget and staffing of the Environmental Regulatory Agency, IBAMA. And highly trained units have reportedly been grounded, and the value of fines imposed for environmental offences has dropped by 43%. And in August, the director of Brazil's National Space Research Institute was forced out of office after the president refuted data on rising deforestation. Now again, of course, the Brazilian government have a different account, and they reject the notion that Brazil does not take care of the Amazon and does not take care of the environment. Now, people will make their own judgment on that, but at the centre of this issue, of course, is the fact that we are in a climate crisis. If the chance to reform its practice and recommit to stopping the fires and returning to anti-deforestation policies is rejected, and the Brazilian president continues to take Brazil down such an environmentally damaging path, I would say that it is right that the international community think hard about how to proceed to best protect the environmental jewel that is the Amazon rainforest. That is hard because it touches on the most basic issues of national sovereignty. Of course, Brazil has reaffirmed many times that this is indeed an issue of sovereignty. They believe that their approach to the Amazon is one for domestic policy alone. But we cannot see this in a vacuum. The Amazon, which spans, I referred to the earlier point earlier, not just Brazil, but Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, Suriname and Venezuela, it's an internationally revered national treasure. And the parts of it that are lost, species some of which are found nowhere else on Earth, will not be recovered. That is a global loss. Indeed.
I thank him for giving way. I think he's touching on something that is so important in our current political debate, that actually nationalism is completely the wrong answer to a global crisis. And we can only solve these things if we think globally rather than just in our own national interest.
The Honourable Lady is right. If only we could find a way of achieving that consensual approach, because this is a global loss. But many will conclude that that risk is that we have that creates a global responsibility to respond to protect it. So how do we solve this dilemma? Greenpeace have called for, and I quote, all trade talks with Brazil to be suspended until the Bolsonaro government changes tack and guarantees the necessary protections. It says that these should include effective support for urgent action by the Brazilian Institute of the Environment and Renewable Natural Resources and other agencies responsible for monitoring and enforcement to tackle environmental crimes and implement forest protections, with guarantees of necessary funding, as well as other measures to improve environmental protections. Now, that's a tough approach. I'm afraid our government seems to take a hope for the best version, with the Minister for the Foreign Office previously telling Parliament that if we help to ensure that sensible trade arrangements are made, those fires can be put out and they will stay out. Now, to me, that seems to me over-optimistic at best, complacent at worst. But we will await the Minister's response today. And if the situation remains as difficult as it currently appears to be, I have to say I'm with Greenpeace. The Amazon rainforest, is sometimes said to provide 20% of our terrestrial oxygen, or 1 in 5 of each of our breaths. Mrs. Moon, most of us now recognise that we are indeed in a climate crisis, and it is time for action. It's time for urgency in our approach, in both domestic and international policy. In his reply, I hope the Minister will be able to reflect a hitherto undetected ambition and urgency to do what is needed, and it could start today by supporting the petitioners in their ambition to secure global action to protect the precious rainforest.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 266638 relating to deforestation in the Amazon. Now, I have 9 people present who put their names down and 16 people in total. I intend to go first to those who have notified the chair in advance. So, Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mrs. Moon, and thank you very much for calling me so early. As always in these debates, one always hopes you have more time to perfect that speech you should have written last week. But as the generosity of the Chair, I'm afraid the Chamber is going to have to receive what I have in front of me. Mrs Moon, I don't think there would be any disagreement in this room as to the importance of the rainforest, be it for the physical entity that it is, or the species, be the animal or plant that it is host to. And as Mr Zeichner has highlighted, the Amazon is much more than just Brazil. So in my contribution, I want to concentrate not just on Brazil, but also next door in Colombia, and potentially draw some comparisons. But my references to Brazil also follow on from my visit to Brazil. I led the IPU delegation there 2 weeks ago. And unfortunately, we had to cut that short due to Parliament being recalled. But one of the key themes of our visit was indeed raising with Brazilian government and parliamentarians and NGOs British views on the rainforest. But on that visit, the one thing that did become clear, particularly when we visited Senate and Congress in Brasilia, was the sensitivity that Brazil feels towards outside criticism. And so voices that are being made across the world in response to the crisis that we see in the rainforest are most certainly being heard. So people should not think that that is not the case. But I think the one area that I would depart from the censure of the essence of the motion before us today is on the need for economic sanctions. Because what I would like us very much to do is to find solidarity and common cause with groups within Brazil who care passionately, in fact, arguably even more passionately because it is their home than the many of us in this room today, and find ways in which we can collaborate and work together in order to unleash the true value of the rainforest. And the value of the rainforest should never be thought of in cutting down trees, because that is a blind short-term gain. The true value of the rainforest can actually be seen next door in Colombia, where the United Kingdom, working in collaboration with Global Colombia, is really unleashing, through collaboration with science, some truly phenomenal long-term possibilities. So, for example, Grow Colombia is a UK-funded 4-year collaboration that involves multiple partners, including the Earlham Institute, University of East Anglia, the Natural History Museum, the Eden Project, Colombia's Humboldt Institute, and the Universidad of Los Andes and the University of Sydney. And the project is designed to demonstrate that biodiversity conservation can drive sustainable economic growth and secure peace and prosperity, in this case in Colombia. But the same lessons can be drawn to many other areas of the Amazon. And what we are seeing there as a result of this project, even in its early days, is transforming former guerrillas into becoming guardians of the rainforest, training people up with no scientific or natural background into be able to recognising unique species and what those species, be it plant or indeed animals, are capable of. Helping farmers to reform their agricultural practices and techniques to grow crops and forage varieties that can bring conservation gains. Enabling producers to identify and cultivate wild relatives of commercially produced coca varieties to make production more profitable, but more eco-friendly, more sustainable and less dependent on human intervention. Teaching rural communities taxoeconomic identification techniques and combining biotechnology resources with practical field work to catalogue species. Assisting policymakers in analysing the socio-economic models for supporting ecological restoration of the rainforest. And above all, coaching rural communities in business models for ecotourism initiatives that guarantee genuine and lasting conservation benefit to the ecosystem. And that is one example that if we were to take some of those package of measures and roll them into Brazil, work in collaboration with Brazil, both your regional governments, because the regional governments in Brazil and getting those on board, particularly in areas such as Amazonia, are every bit important as dealing with your federal government in Brasilia. That it's that level of cooperation, and some of that cooperation, Madam Chairman, is already beginning to get underway with the United Kingdom. And one of the areas that I would just really urge government to continue to work on is pointing out to Brazil that not only are you an economic powerhouse when it comes to the variety of rare species that you have, but if those are harnessed properly, as we are beginning to see happen in Colombia, the potential for biotech and pharmaceutical applications of some of those very, very complex and rare plant species could actually generate billions and billions and billions of sustainable, clean revenue that would benefit, in terms of healthcare applications, that would benefit the planet long term, and also generates revenues that can benefit the science community in Brazil and can actually then flow through to benefit communities, particularly the indigenous communities in these areas. So, yeah, happy to, yeah.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He's making an extremely well-informed and powerful speech. Could he perhaps just tell us a little bit more about what level of enthusiasm there is in the Brazilian government for adopting a similar scheme to grow Colombia within Brazil, and would that be part of the answer to Brazil seeing this as a global as well as a Brazilian issue?
Indeed. I thank the honourable friend for intervention. And again, I would just sort of point out the importance of the federal and your state governments and legislatures. There is, as I said, huge sensitivity around the criticism that has been directed towards Brazil, particularly in recent months. And there's a danger that that shuts off avenues of cooperation and dialogue and discussion, and actually prevent some of the really positive things that we want to try, I think everyone in this room wants to try and achieve. And so Brazil, I get particularly in your rural areas, people want to be better off. They want better standards of education, better employment opportunities, better prospects for their children than they had themselves. And I think it is about showing them a way that that can be done without following a path of devastation and destruction, because that, I'm afraid, is something that can often be, you can cash in the trees once. The other things that I've touched on can pay you dividends much, much longer term. And also another reason why we should not be going down the path of sanctions or threatened sanctions, and that is Brazil is also a global superpower when it comes to the potential it has for renewable energy, both solar and wind, with its enormous coast, and of course it is tremendous access to the sun. But UK companies are now the biggest investors in Brazil when it comes to solar generation. The City of London, through access to green finance and green reinsurance markets, are fundamental in unlocking some of that sustained renewable power. And many of these schemes are also micro-schemes. So the very people that we've talked about that live away from the coast, that live in isolated, poor communities, where access to energy and affordable, sustainable energy has often plagued Brazil, many of these micro-schemes can be unlocked. But they can only be unlocked by global cooperation, by free-flowing of finance to be able to ensure that there's somebody helping to finance these schemes long-term. And simply pulling up the drawbridge, saying no more cooperation, we're withdrawing from trade agreements, we're withdrawing from trade discussions with you, I'm afraid what that does do is it strengthens the hand of people that actually want to build a wall around Brazil, to say, there they go again, the imperialists are threatening us, we shouldn't listen to anything they've got to say, we do things our way. And the voices within Brazil that want cooperation, that want to follow a path of alternatives to deforestation, actually their hands get weakened, I'm afraid, as a result of this. And so, Madam Chairman, I will bring my conclusion, my comments to a close. But as somebody who's very passionate about Latin America, who's visited Bolivia, the Yungles in Bolivia, I've visited Colombia 3 times, in fact 5 times, in my role as trade envoy. I know very much that the economic power that these rainforests have. And it's not just about protecting rare species. It is about protecting rare species. It is about defending an ecosystem. But it is about allowing those people to earn a fantastic living, but at the same time protecting the environments that are precious and unique And I think if we get this right, we can do both.
Kerry McCarthy.
Mrs. Moon, it's always a pleasure to see you in the chair. I don't think it will surprise anyone that I'm not going to adopt the same conciliatory tone that the honourable member who's just spoken has done. I think the situation that we're facing now is far too serious to adopt such approach. As we've heard, the Amazon is being willfully destroyed. It remains the biggest rainforest in the world and a vital check on climate change. The seriousness of this cannot be underestimated. And as the Honourable Member for Cambridge said, there are people gathered outside this building today that want us to take it seriously. I also make no apologies for referring back to a debate that I held in this hall in March 2009, which was on livestock's impact on the environment. And it's something that I was just actually reading back on the speech, which I actually think was rather good. But the minister's response was appalling. She basically went on at some length about how she really liked her mum's shepherd's pie. And I would like to think we've made progress since then. We're certainly talking about the issue more, but in terms of actual action, I'm not sure that we have met, well, we've certainly not made as much progress as I would have hoped back then. Extensive cattle ranching is the #1 culprit of deforestation in virtually every Amazon country. It accounts for 80% of current deforestation and is responsible for the release of 340 million tonnes of carbon into the atmosphere every year. That's equivalent to 3.4% of current global emissions. Amazon Brazil is home to approximately 200 million head of cattle and is the largest exporter in the world, supplying around 1/4 of the global market. The impact of cattle ranching and deforestation was first publicised by conservationists in the early 1980s. They coined the phrase the hamburger connection, but actually it was fairly small business back then. Since then, government incentives, improvements in the road and electricity networks, as well as meat processing facilities, spurred the industry. And then with the devaluation of the currency and much of Brazil's herd declared foot-and-mouth free, the exports absolutely took off and exploded, which led to the situation we have now with deforestation. Typically with deforestation, it doesn't start with animal agriculture. It will start when roads are cut through the forest, open it up for logging and mining. Once the forest along the road has been cleared, commercial or subsistence farmers move in and start growing crops. However, forest soils are too nutrient poor and fragile to sustain crops for long. So after 2 or 3 years, when the soil is depleted, crop yields fall and farmers let the grass and grow on. And that's when the ranchers move in. Little investment is needed to start raising cattle on cheap or abandoned land where grass is already growing. And the returns can be high, at least for a while. But after 5 to 10 years, overgrazing and nutrient loss turn the rainforest land that was once filled with biological biodiversity into an eroded wasteland, so they have to look for somewhere else to move on. And as we've heard, deforestation causes irreversible environmental damage if it's not checked in time. The clearing and burning of forests releases billions of tonnes of CO2 and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Scientists estimate that deforestation causes roughly 1/4 of all human-induced carbon emissions. And then there's the loss of biodiversity. And it's absolutely anyone who's been to the rainforest. I've not been to Brazil, but I've been to countries such as Belize, where, it's just amazing to the extent to which it is still undiscovered and unexplored. And there is so much more that is there to be discovered. Forests are home to more than 13 million distinct species, representing more than 2/3 of all the world's plants and animals. And obviously, if their habitats are destroyed, many of those will be at risk of extinction. And when the trees are gone, the soil becomes depleted, as I said, and that can often lead to water pollution as the soil gets washed away too. And that is something which we in this country must accept responsibility for.
She's making an extremely powerful speech, which I entirely agree. Everything she's saying about the rainforest, I have visited many times, is absolutely true. It's a huge crisis, a huge catastrophe. But surely the point of this debate is not so much to say how awful it all is, as to what can we now do about it. And the petitioners are requesting trade sanctions against Brazil. The question is, how efficacious would that be in persuading the current government of Brazil to go back to what the government was doing only a year ago?
I'm getting on to what I think needs to be done. And, I think sanctions could play a part, but I think that change in consumption habits could also play a much bigger part, and that's something that each of us has some control over. In the recent Risky Business report from WWF and the RSPB, they estimated that more than 40% of the UK's overseas land footprint, nearly 6 million hectares, is in countries at high or very high risk of deforestation, as well as weak governance and poor labour standards. And actually, the more you read about this, you see the links between this trade and modern slavery and human rights abuses, people being displaced from their land and so on. It's all part and parcel of the same thing. And as I said, in this report, they looked at 7 key agricultural commodities imported into the UK: beef and leather, cocoa, palm oil, pulp and paper, rubber, soy and timber. And of these, beef and leather caused our highest land footprint overseas by far. And that's despite the fact that we produce almost 80% of our own beef in the UK, and we import a lot from Ireland too. But the actual picture is much worse than just looking at beef alone, because you have to look at animal feed. And in the EU, around 90% of soy imports is for livestock feed. So it's not just a case of beef from Argentina or Brazil being bad and British beef's fine, as I've often heard people try to argue. And yes, there is a case for pasture-fed livestock. I chair the all-party group on agroecology, and the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association is a very active member of that group. But that's not what we're talking about here. Every year, the UK consumes around 3.3 million tonnes of soy, over 75% of which is related to meat consumption, either as imported animal feed or soy embedded in imported meat products. And then there's also the animal feed for the chickens, laying the eggs, and the dairy herds too. And soybean oil, which is the second most widely used vegetable oil after palm oil. I remember, this happened to me many, many times, but I remember one particular time when the former farming minister, Jim Pace, tried to tell me that it was all down to people eating veggie burgers, and I can assure people that that isn't the case at all. I think it may have gone up in recent years, but I think it's still well below 5%. But yeah, it's all the vegetarian and vegans' fault, as usual. It is actually interesting to compare what's happened with soybean oil compared to palm oil. We import nearly 3 times as much soy oil as we do palm oil, yet it's palm oil which has tended to receive the attention from environmentalists, which I think is probably because of the orangutans. It means now that 21% of global palm oil production is now certified, whereas for soy, whether it's through the Roundtable for Responsible Soy or the ProTerra certification, it accounts for only about 2% of global production.
I'm very grateful for her to give way. It is true we can't be sort of sanctimonious and hypocritical and not allow developing countries to tell them what to do when we in the past have also deforested our country. But we know a lot more now what the consequences are. And I think she's making a very powerful point. Is it not about conscious consumption, responsible consumption that we can all adopt in this country and promote politically, rather than saying, we don't really need to do anything about it, it's not about sanctions. It must be about all of us understanding that we are responsible too.
I think it is, and there's been some really interesting global initiatives or attempts at global initiatives. I remember back when I was a shadow minister in the Foreign Affairs team, meeting representatives from Ecuador, and Yasuni National Park in Ecuador is almost as biologically diverse and as amazing as the Galapagos Islands, but they discovered oil there, and they were looking to raise funds worldwide so that people would basically saying to people, we're a poor country, we need to exploit our natural resources, we need to get the finances in. If you don't want us to do that, if you think that's appalling, well, give us some money to not do it. And actually, it wasn't very successful, as I understand it. It didn't raise anywhere near the money, and they did end up having to exploit the natural resources. But if you look then at Seychelles, they issued an ocean bond, and basically saying, we will protect our marine areas, we will not overfish, if people give us money to do that. And actually Seychelles, although there's some very wealthy people, there's a lot of poverty too. And that was really successful, this blue bond. So I think we need to look at initiatives like that to sort of see. So it's not just about the sanctions, it is about working together and accepting. As you say, if it's just us saying you can't exploit what you've got when we've exploited everything that we've got, and we've been to many other countries and exploited what they've got as well over the centuries, I do think that is the wrong approach. Going back to my notes, 77% of UK soy imports come from high-risk countries, Argentina, Brazil and Paraguay. And the NGO Global Witness, in its recent Money to Burn report, identified the financial institutions behind 6 key agribusiness companies involved in deforesting climate-critical forests in Brazil, as well as the Congo Basin and New Guinea. They revealed that UK-based financial institutions were the second biggest source of financing, providing $6.5 billion US dollars. So I think the UK has a huge responsibility to take action to tackle the source of financing for deforestation. And I would urge people to read that report. It's really powerful. And that means we must have due diligence regulation across sectors throughout the supply chain, looking at investors so that people know what their money is being invested in. I think that would send a really important message to businesses, and that would mean that companies would then change the way they operate as well. As I've said, I held a debate back in 2009 in this chamber, and that was in part prompted by the UN's report, Livestock's Long Shadow. It was the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, which had been released in 2006. And that made a compelling case for action to tackle the consequences for the climate and for our natural environment of the ever more industrialised and intensive livestock industry. And I said in that debate, it is a supremely inefficient use of land to use it to grow animal feed. It takes around 8 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef. There's a huge water footprint too. It takes almost 21 square metres of land to produce 1 kilogram of beef, compared to 0.3 square metres to produce a kilogram of vegetables. Since then, there have been numerous other highly authoritative reports making the same arguments. They make the headlines. Most people agree that something needs to be done, and yet we seem to be no closer to action other than people choosing to make their own decisions about what they consume. I want to finish just by expressing my disappointment at the recent report from the Committee on Climate Change on how we reach net zero. And it was, frankly, pretty pathetic. I went along to the launch, and the chair of the committee said that his least favourite, this was in his opening speech, that his least favourite environmentalists were those who expected people to be cold in their homes or to eat disgusting food. We were there, and I thought, what does he mean by disgusting food? I can guess. We were there. This is the man who fed his daughter Cordelia a hamburger at the height of the BSE crisis. So I think we know where he's coming from. We were then told that because people couldn't be expected to eat disgusting food, the Committee on Climate Change's recommendation was for only a 20% reduction in red meat consumption, and that was to be replaced primarily with pork, bacon and poultry rather than plant-based meals. The Committee on Climate Change was meant to be looking at how deliverable net zero was, primarily from an economic point of view, whether we could actually afford to make the transition to electric vehicles, for example. But they did also look at behavioural change and how palatable that would be to the general public. I gather that the behavioural scientist that sits on the committee actually is a specialist in shifting methods of transport rather than in diets, but they took his word on what people would tolerate. And I would just make it clear, I think, referring again to the people that are outside, the people that I know, particularly younger people that have contacted me, I think people are willing to play their part. I think people want to know about the damage that their consumption habits are doing. It is not just a question of them being able to exercise the choice. The market needs to respond to that. We need more transparency so that people are educated, can make those choices. But we also do need the government to step in to ensure that people are in a position to make those choices too.
Steve Brine.
Thank you very much, Mrs Moon. And it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady. I hope it won't be another 10 years before she makes a speech on this subject. But I really enjoyed her contribution and I found it very educational, so thank her for that. I also want to thank the Petitions Committee, who, as a minister who's a former minister who's sat in that place many times responding to Petition Committee debates, it's nice to be on the other side. But I want to thank them for bringing this forward, and to the just over 300 of my constituents who signed this petition. I think I know them all. I also want to thank the school children who also raised this with me in every school I go to, every school that I have visit here at the House, and to my own too, who raised this with me. And also to the Honourable Gentleman from Cambridge for the way that he set out the issue so clearly in, I think, his opening remarks today. I don't want to speak for long, Mrs Moon, you'll be pleased to know. I just want to make 3 brief points as my contribution, if I may. First of all, on the personal. As I have droned on to anybody who will listen, who's asked about this environmental area of policy since I was elected. This is the issue that got me here. This is the issue that got me to open my eyes as a schoolboy when I was no older than my 8-year-old son is now. I remember seeing the issue on television. I remember protesting at the television about the issue and my parents saying it's no good telling them, tell somebody else, do something about it. And that was what got me to open my eyes as an activist, and that is what got me to a lifetime of activism. That's what got me to join Friends of the Earth when I was a relatively young man, and ultimately to pursue a career in politics. And ever since I was adopted as the candidate for Winchester back in 2007, I have campaigned relentlessly under the Green Winchester umbrella on all sorts of issues. But I've always returned to this issue. I remember as a schoolboy writing articles, holding debates. I even wrote a poem for the school poetry competition on the subject, which the swines didn't let me win with, but there you go. And so it's an issue that I've always returned to. So, you know, while the rates of deforestation in the 80s, when I was at school, and continuing to the 90s, they were deeply troubling, and I guess they led to the sort of coverage on the television that caught my attention and raised my ire. It seems more recent years have given cause for hope in the Amazon. So yes, deforestation has been a concern in the region for some years, and I'm noting the excellent House of Commons Library briefing for this, that the New York Declaration published this year said that Brazil lost almost 55 million hectares of tree cover at a rate of this 5.7 soccer fields per minute. More than 84% of the loss occurred in the Amazon, an area bigger than Norway. But previous Brazilian governments have adopted a series of legal and administrative approaches aimed at reducing this, which led to a real decline in loss rates. So as the Declaration reports, the Amazon has long been held as a success story in global forest conservation efforts. In 2012, Brazil recorded its lowest deforestation rates in the last 20 years. It's a point worth repeating from the opening speech. And it's worth saying, because soy was raised in the previous contribution, that the world's first 2 large-scale voluntary commitments to reducing deforestation were based in the Amazon, namely the 2006 sector-wide soy moratorium and the 2009 company-specific cattle Brazil, forging public-private cooperation agreements. And nearly 50 companies have endorsed the soy moratorium, covering 90% of the soy trade in the Brazilian Amazon, while 18 of the country's 22 largest meat processors have committed to at least one of the cattle agreements. But I note that these approaches were successful, yet trends in slowing forest loss have been reversed in recent years. And in the period after 2012, deforestation has again increased, no doubt generating more young boys like me and young girls shouting at the television or outside in Westminster today. And the reversal in the trend towards slowing forest loss has been particularly acute this year, which is what worries us all so much, as the Declaration, the New York Declaration Progress Report, published in September of this year, says tree cover loss in the Amazon began to rise again in 2016 when it reached the 3.7 million hectares. While the rate of loss has fallen in the past 2 years, it's still higher than it had been since 2005. For the Amazon, deforestation rates continue to rise in the first part of this year, with an alarming 88% increase in June compared to the same month in the previous year. And I think it is worth repeating the point that my honourable friend raised earlier, that deforestation in Bolivia and Peru is also increasing. So it isn't just Brazil, but of course it is mainly. The other point, I mean, lots of points have been made about the indigenous peoples and ecosystems, and I'm not going to repeat all of them, but as a former health minister and a former cancer minister, it is often said that the Amazon is the world's largest medicine cabinet, and it is a good point. Around 25% of all the drugs used today derive from rainforest plants. And the point that I always used to, one of the shouty TV moments for me was, you know, the logic suggests that on the balance of probability, if it's that high a percentage that we know that has come from the rainforest, what else is out there? You know, for those of us who fought and lost cancer as many times as I have and many have in this room, wouldn't it just be wonderful? Yes, if we could detect more cancers early, as is this government's ambition. But we're not going to do it for all, and we're going to need medicines and we're going to need drugs to treat them. And what is out there? That is, for me, the great question, is what else is out there? And my third point that I also want to talk to is about the response, because obviously that's what the petitioners are interested in. Now I understand President Bolsonaro's view on sovereignty, and of course, international law would be on his side in respect of sovereignty of his land. But I would argue that sovereignty of our planet is all of our sovereignty. And some 40 years later, from me being raised into political activism of some sort, we are still having this conversation. And what's worse, this conversation is getting more acute and more worrying because deforestation seems to be going in the wrong direction again. Now, I also understand the argument that we need to help Brazil trade its way out of this. And I thought that the point raised by my honourable friend from Far was very, very, very well made. And I listened acutely to what he said. He's visited the area many, many times. But, it's often said that, the Amazon basin has got a population living in poverty, and that is undoubtedly true. But most deforestation, a lot of deforestation, doesn't stem from poverty. And according to the federal government, 32.5% of deforestation in 2016 happened in big farms, and 24.5% in invaded public land, while 30% happened in smallholder agricultural land possessions, and 11% inside protected areas that allow for economic activities. So much of deforestation, especially in squatted land, is commissioned by people who don't live in the Amazon, which include gangs of land speculators and other forms of organised crime. So most of the big farmers and the land grabbers come from Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, Parana, and other southern states attracted by the cheap land and the low law enforcement that there is in Brazil. So I do understand that argument, but it worries me. On the response, around the G20 summit this year, obviously France and Ireland raised the prospect that they wouldn't ratify the huge trade deal with South American nations unless Brazil does more to fight fires in the Amazon. Now, French President Macron said that President Bolsonaro had lied to him about his stance on climate change. His words. Now, our Prime Minister called the fires that were raging in the Amazon at the time not only heartbreaking but an international crisis. We stand ready to provide whatever help we can to help them under control and to help protect one of the Earth's greatest wonders. And German Chancellor Merkel called the fire an acute emergency, shocking and threatening not only for Brazil and the other affected countries but also for the whole world. I agree with all of those statements. But I would suggest that this deal, far from withdrawing from trade negotiations, I'm not arguing that we should withdraw from trade negotiations. I'm suggesting that the deal explicitly says that countries have to commit to tackling climate change, and therefore I would suggest that all we're asking is that the EU, of which we are still currently a member, hold Brazil to those commitments within that emerging agreement. And that seems perfectly reasonable to me. So, in closing, Mrs. Moon, I guess my point is that some 40 years on, we're still having this conversation. If we're still having this conversation in 40 years' time, it won't be a problem, it will be a bit of history. And it'll be a bit of history that's gone forever. And then those medicines that we may have found that may produce that cure for those terrible diseases that I've spent many hours in this Westminster Hall answering debates about and our constituents are affected by will not be found. And that seems to me like a stain on humanity if we let that happen. And it seems that, to me, the sovereignty point needs to be taken and balanced alongside that argument. So when the excellent Minister responds, who is a good friend, I would ask him to set out Her Majesty's Government's latest position on the EU-Mercosur trade deal, both as a member state and presumably from November the 1st as a former member state. Where do we stand? What leverage do we as a government propose to put onto Brazil and to those other neighbouring countries that have been mentioned? Because I won't be here in 40 years' time, but maybe my son will, and I really don't want him to be having the same argument that we are. Thank you.
Larry Schumann.
For if I repeat anything anyone else has said, but it's been such a good debate and such really excellent contributions that I'm not going to push too many statistics. But I've always been involved in environmental issues. I was very early in my career, before I got into Parliament, started something called SERA, the Socialist Environmental Resource Association, and I started the first branch of Friends of the Earth in England and Wales, in Swansea. And I also have started a number of organisations like Urban Minds. So I do the environment in a sense, but I've obviously not done it very effectively. I've been in this place for 40 years, and we have not woken up to the fact that we are destroying our planet. It is a fragile planet, and we are destroying it. And we seem to be hell-bent on destroying it. And why I support most of the motion today, most of this petition, I do think it is multifaceted. I have worked with Brazilians and South Americans. I used to be a co-chair of the British-Brazil group of parliamentarians. I started a charity in Peru working on development, both rural and urban development, giving jobs to young people in Lima, in the town, and out in the countryside. So I do know the work. But what I do know is that these aren't primitive, backward people. These are highly intelligent, clever people. They are very often absolutely let down by bad governance, but they are very talented scientists. Some of the best technology, science and innovation takes place in Brazil. They were one of the best competitors in the aircraft. That's a pretty sophisticated industry. And so Brazil has enormous talent. And I sometimes think, why don't we reach out to that talent more effectively? I get fed up, and I think the time is coming when the International Parliamentary Union, the IPU, and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the CPA, have got to wake up to the fact that getting on planes and going visiting and talking to other parliamentarians is something of the past. Ms. Reid, some of our colleagues will not like that, but we've got to develop new techniques for parliamentarians across the globe working together, and we can do it by clever video conferences. The social media potential is enormous, and I think we should reflect as parliamentarians, because we often talk about it's government. It's government. I myself intervened on the very good speech of my honourable friend from Cambridge when I said, look, the economics minister on the BBC World Service was very poor, I thought, this morning. But there are also other major influences that are poor. When I talk to my Brazilian friends, and I work with a number of Brazilian legislators on reducing road deaths in Brazil, which is a very big killer. So I know about international working. But sometimes they do say to me, yes, indeed.
A great and powerful contribution from an honourable member. Can I encourage him to renew his interest in not just the IPU, but more importantly, the Latin American all-party group, because we engage in many of the issues the honourable friend has talked about, and with that knowledge and expertise, he'll make a very, very valuable new member.
Thank you very much. I will think of revisiting my level of activity in the group. But can I also say Mrs. Bing, that when I speak to clever Brazilians, they say to me, but what you've done to the world, you've deforested Europe, at present you are probably despoiling the quality of soil right across Europe and in the UK. You are doing dreadful things that are awful for the environment as well. And then you look at the fact of the matter that we're exporting some of the worst chemicals for people all over the world to put on their land. Indeed, Syngenta, my own constituency, makes weed killers that you can't sell in Europe, but they export them beyond Europe. So we have a conscience about what we're exporting, the soil degradation that we're causing, and the fact that we have got to prove to the Brazilians we are concerned about climate change worldwide. I've been inspired by the young people. I have I have 12 grandchildren, 4 of them live in Cambridge, and a couple of them have been leaders in the campaign, of climate change campaign. And indeed, my honourable friend brought one of my granddaughters, Lola, up to meet Michael Gove. And shows how active we are in the cross-party basis. But the fact of the matter is, I'm inspired. Young people have got it. You know, Greta Thunberg, who we invited to this place, galvanised the level of activity and interest. And on the other side, just young people coming out. You know, in Huddersfield the other day, we had, you know, wonderful St George's Square with great speakers from young people. So it's young people that excite me because they've got it and things are changing. They're changing what they eat. There are more vegans, and you know, there's a lovely card I bought for a friend the other day because the honourable lady, many years ago, well, about 2 or 3 years ago, got me to join the Vegetarian and Vegan Society. I don't know I'm as good as pursuing that as she is, but I helped her be quorate on a particular day. But the fact of the matter is, young people's habits, eating, what they do, their impact on the environment, they're changing fast. And then my other inspiration is Professor Steve Evans, who just produced a book which I've just finished reviewing. Professor Steve Evans at University College London, this new book, Here Comes the Sun. If you want to know the real science, he's a Reith lecturer. He's one of the leading experts in the world. I tell you, read it. It's a hard read, but it tells the unvarnished truth about how we are destroying the climate. And it isn't just about, you know, the species and the wonderful flora and fauna in the Amazon. It's the fact that it is that Amazon rainforest that helps regulate the weather globally. And when are people going to wake up to these changes, these fires, these droughts, these floods are related to climate change? And of course, if you want to pick on anyone big and say, it's your fault, mate, well, don't pick just on the Brazilian leadership. Just look North America and look at President Trump. Yes? If you want to know who has changed a lot of the attitudes in South America, it's the attitude of the President of the United States, which has changed dramatically from Obama to this present president. So let's be, firstly, recognise that our delicate, fragile planet is desperately in trouble, and we're not going to hand anything on to our children and grandchildren if we don't act now and act positively. And that means sharing technology, sharing science, sharing innovation, giving it to the Chinese. You don't do anything about what the Chinese... Do you know, the Chinese have no longer got any bees. They have so intensively agriculture is so intensified, they hand-pollinate. They've killed all the bees in China. Yes? And then in North America, they've killed all the songbirds. Most of the songbirds have been killed in North America. We've got to wake up to the urgency of what we face, but not then despair and say, oh, it's all too difficult for us, we can't tackle this. Good science, good technology, sharing information, sharing new methods of agriculture. And also new, as my honourable friend said very powerfully, new ways of consuming. I was just going to finish. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way because he makes such a powerful speech, and had I appreciated he was coming to the end of his, I would have backed off. But just on the point really about consumption and the points that he was making about young people and how informed they are, and I'm sure he is struck by that, and he was talking about his grandchildren and just how knowledgeable they are and how that knowledge and that information is really informing them in the decisions and the choices they make. And that should be inspirational to all of us in the way that my honourable friend is suggesting. And I was amazed at visiting various primary schools how so many of the children say, well, we don't eat those biscuits because they've got so much palm oil. And we're talking about Brazil here and the impact on the rainforest of Brazil. But you look at the rainforest fires in Indonesia, where there's widespread devastation, clearance for palm oil, which of course goes into so many of our foodstuffs. Does he agree that this is a massive, wide, global issue? Obviously, we're talking about Brazil here, but it is a wider thing across our globe.
Very grateful for that helpful intervention. And again, reiterate that my Bible has become Professor Steve Evans, who, interesting enough, is almost banned by the BBC. Because he said, the trouble is, you can't get a decent debate on climate change on radio and television because BBC, this daft idea of balance. And so Steve can't get on as a leading professor in science because they can't find anyone, apparently, better qualified than Nigel Lawson to be balanced. And so he's almost banned from the BBC because he knows too much. What a crazy world. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that we know what's happening, we know about the science, and we know we have the keys if we share information. We are lazy as parliamentarians too often. Don't get on a plane, bring them together, and there's a group of us working together. How do we, deep into the 21st century, communicate with other legislators around the world in a positive and supportive way? Anyone who could join that group with me, I'm having a meeting on it. It's coming this a day or two tomorrow, on Wednesday.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to see you in the chair, and I want to congratulate the over 120,000 signatories of this petition, because it seems that more and more it's actually the people outside who bring the most pertinent discussions to this House. And we're having a good discussion. I'm happy to acknowledge that. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Huddersfield and his enthusiasm, which I share, that actually, if we put our mind to it, there are solutions to the climate crisis, and we must not be gloomy. And we hear now increasingly about people who get really depressed about the future, and increasingly young people. And that, on top of actually the challenge that we have, is something that I think would be devastating if we allow that to continue. The honourable member across is just leaving the room, but it was a particular pleasure to listen to what he was saying. And I have to say, one of my favourite films is The Life of Brian. And do you remember at the end of it, the committee is still debating and Brian is already on the cross. This is what we often do. We debate and we don't acknowledge the emergency of what is actually in front of us. And I share the impatience of everybody who has been demonstrating today and will continue to demonstrate outside. Extinction Rebellion. I, like the honourable member from Cambridge, have become a member of Greenpeace over 30 years ago in Germany. This is not a new thing. We knew about it, and yet what have we done about it? And if anything, we will have to justify to future generations that we actually knew about this. And the Committee for Climate Change chair has actually said we have a moral duty because we know what to do about it, so let's do it. And that is really the impetus, and that is the responses I would like to see from the government as well. There is an emergency. We know what to do about it. Let's not just say, well, we have already done quite a lot. We have definitely not done enough. And that is what these debates are all about. And I hope that we find a cross-party consensus about the emergency and that we need to do a lot more. It's a massive challenge. Young people are reminding us how big the challenge is. We don't want to be depressed about it, but we need to do a lot more. And I must say, I take a slightly more grim view of the Brazilian government. And as the honourable member, of course, said, actually, deforestation had slowed down between 2004 and 2014, or 13, I think. I can't quite remember what the figures are. But it's increasing again, and that is what is disappointing. That is where we need to look. What is it actually? If we could do it between 2004 and 2012, why has it gone backwards? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. So the deforestation in the Amazon is a global crisis. The Amazon is the largest carbon dioxide sink in the world, and captures and stores a huge amount of CO2, doing heavy lifting in the fight to stop the looming climate crisis for all of us. And during the summer, reports emerged about the huge expansion of the Amazon rainforest fires. And although wildfires are seasonal and play a role in regenerating wildlife, the fires raging in the Amazon rainforest were much larger than usual. If the Brazilian government continues to ignore the extent of the damage, these fires pose a serious threat to the Amazon biome. And again, I understand the argument that it is a bit rich for us to pontificate if we have actually in the past also deforested, and if indeed our economies are ultimately profiting from what is happening elsewhere in the world. But responsible governments do see where actually there has to be something like a carrot and a stick. And I think we need to go and apply a bit of a stick, not just a carrot. We need global cooperation if we have any chance of keeping rising global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And if we continue on the trajectory, I think global temperatures are currently predicted to rise to about 3 degrees. Now, that is just not acceptable, and we cannot be complacent. If we fail, we'll face an irreversible climate crisis, which evidence suggests will destroy ecosystems, cause the extinction of thousands of species, and displace much of the world's population. And I think this is one of the wider political problems. The climate crisis and climate catastrophe will very disproportionately affect the world. There will be some countries, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, which will be okay, and Britain is probably going to be one of the countries that is going to be okay. But what about Africa as a continent? What about the Southern Hemisphere? And if we really think globally, and if we believe that we cannot just let other countries and just sink into the ocean or have intolerable temperatures so it cannot sustain human lives, then our response has to be urgent. It is our global moral responsibility to act. And so far, I don't think this government has really woken up to this emergency. The only way we can stop this for everyone on every level to do their bit, from the individual to our international bodies, which represent groups of nations. And the Brazilian President, Bolsonaro, has, it seems, so far not shown any interest in really averting the climate catastrophe and put forward some climate action. And I want to be very political here. He is a populist leader who, I believe, in my opinion, he actually uses environmental chaos, social instability, and economic disruption for his own political gain. He has no regard for the long-term implication of rainforest destructions, and it would be naive to think Bolsonaro turns a blind eye only for short-term financial success. Burning down the rainforest and literally fueling the climate crisis is consistent with his disruptive political agenda. That is what I believe. And it matters to stand up to these populist leaders who seek to divide people. It matters not just for the people of this world, it matters for the planet. I fully agree with the proposed motion signed by 122,578 people across the UK. We cannot afford to sit on the fence and let other countries do the work. If this government is serious about reaching net zero, if this government is serious about preserving our environment for future generations, we must do more now. Liberal Democrats MEPs have been playing a central role within the EU in challenging Mr. Bolsonaro's policy and working with other EU partners to figure out how to challenge his destructive agenda. And again, I take the honourable member's point. It's no good just to do sanctions, but the European Union, who is usually very good on international cooperation, they have proposed this path, and I do believe the British government should actually fall in line and do the same, and really put some stick into its action towards the Brazilian government. International pressure is the way to build incentives for Brazil to protect their rainforests and step up in the fight against the climate crisis. This is where our membership of the EU is central, allowing us to lead the fight against populism and climate destruction. By promising to leave the EU on October the 31st, this government is recklessly putting the UK out into the cold, where our power and influence is going to be much diminished. The fight to reach net zero and save our planet for future generations will be the biggest challenge we have ever faced, and we owe it to future generations to act and do something now. I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and she's making some very powerful points. Does she agree with me, and perhaps the point being made by the member for honourable member for Winchester, in talking about that this is almost like a double whammy, because it's not just the fact that we depend on these international organisations to oversee and show responsibility for these challenges that are multinational; they're not national. And that by leaving the EU, that will make things so much tougher for us. But also to underline the point as the Honourable Member for Winchester was saying, about where we see ourselves and the opportunity and the challenge, perhaps the threats, of doing global trade deals, free trade agreements with countries such as Brazil, where we are in a weaker position. There will be a hint of desperation about trying to strike an early deal with them, and where we are seeking to get exports to them, but prepared to take more beef from them, and of course that comes at the expense of the rainforest. And so does she agree with me? It is not just simply about the international organisations, but also about our future trade arrangements and the power we have or don't have in them.
He's making a very powerful point, and it is, again, who do we see ourselves to be in the world? Are we actually supporting nationalist governments who will ultimately, when it really becomes difficult, so pull up fences, pull up the drawbridge, and not let people in anymore, and say, well, we are okay, but basically sod everybody else. Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, but international solidarity, our humanity demands of us to act globally and not just do things in our national interest. And that is why I've always believed being a member of the European Union is part of that attitude of being global, thinking cooperatively, and not only in our own national interest. Of course, national interest matters. Everybody can discover their national interest at some point. But it is very dangerous to think in this world. And when we look at the global challenges, we have to solve them globally and be a good global player. And wow, hasn't Britain been leading the way internationally for so many decades? And I've become a proud British citizen because I believe in that sort of Britain and not in a small-minded, narrow Britain. I'm coming to the close of my remarks. We cannot get there without global action, and we must respond with one voice when a leader like Bolsonaro fails to take the climate crisis seriously. And I hope the Minister will take on board what has been said so far this afternoon. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mrs Moon. It's a real pleasure to serve under you in the chair this afternoon. And as has been heard in this chamber by honourable friends from Cambridge, Bath, Huddersfield, Bristol, Winchester, we have got a real crisis on our hands. Whilst Parliament did declare a climate emergency, the word emergency seems to have slipped the lexicon, and therefore it's really important in this debate that we ensure that the government hear very clearly the responsibility that it has, not just for our generation, but future generations too, and not just for our nation, but as a global partner to ensure that we get this right. After all, it's only a fleeting time that we're on this planet, and therefore we carry such huge responsibility, not least in being elected to this place, to ensure that we do absolutely everything within our powers to make sure that we address the climate injustice that we're seeing at this time. As has already been described by people speaking in this debate, the Amazon basin sits there as home and habitat to unique biospheres. And of course, it is being degraded at such an accelerating pace at this time that it's of real concern. And that has been true under the leadership of Mr. Bolsonaro. And therefore, I believe that we have got a responsibility in this Parliament to put the pressure on the leaderships where they fail. We speak so much about how we have such global influence. I've heard that in debate after debate since being in this House. But unless we are using that influence, then it is futile. And therefore, we recognise the progress that Brazil has made in setting stringent targets on itself and moving towards those. However, if it is now regressing, as seems to be the case, then all of that is tokenistic. And therefore, we have got serious responsibility, not only to get to grips with the real issues before us, but to ensure that other countries do likewise in solidarity with us, and also to put the appropriate pressure, leverage, and put our power in the right place in ensuring that Brazil falls into line, as with many other countries where we are seeing deforestation as well. Now, we must be reminded that the Amazon rainforest is, 7 million squared kilometres, of which there's 5.5 million squared kilometres of rainforest itself in the Amazon basin, of which 60% is in Brazil. So Brazil is significant in this debate. 1 in 10 species live in the Amazon, a quarter of terrestrial species, and it accounts for half the world's tropical forest area. 34 million people also live there, of which there are 385 indigenous groups that depend on its resources. And we haven't heard about the people in this debate, but the people themselves it's absolutely vital that we protect their environment, the environment in which they live, as opposed to being moved out of the places where for generations they have respected and treated with such kindness and diligence their local environment. And of course, South America itself is such an incredible carbon store, and where we see the loss, as my honourable friend said, of 5.7 football pitches every minute. It must wake us up, and it's worth repeating those statistics until they're etched on our minds, the scale of devastation that we're seeing. This is why Brazil's commitment at COP24 was so significant, stating that carbon emissions were to decrease by 37% in 2025 and 43% in 2030, and why it's even more alarming by the fact that we have heard that President Bolsonaro wants to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, where at that conference it was stated that an additional 94 million more hectares of key biomes would be protected, on top of the 335 already protected areas. However, we are seeing regression. We're seeing Bolsonaro looking the other way. The first part of 2019 has seen an 88% rise in the rate of deforestation, and the New Scientist report that in July alone, just 1 month, 31 days, 3,700 square kilometres were lost. And there has been 84% increase in fires compared to the same period just 1 year previously. 77,000 fires recorded on satellite data. So we haven't taken our eyes off the ball, but we can't do nothing at this time and just comment as we are today in this chamber, but we have to act. And of course, these facts can no longer be hidden, because the reality is we see the propaganda machines come out when these figures are challenged, but technology itself is telling the story for us. And of course, we've seen the rises in agricultural activities. My humble friend for Bristol highlighted, of course, in the beef industry and in soy, in logging and mining, and also in land speculation, buying up that vital habitat, and of course urban development moving in onto core sites. Then, of course, this is not just driven by internal politics, but by international trade, financing and political determinations. And of course, this is all happening at a time when enforcement agencies within Brazil are being stripped of their funding and their ability to act. I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And just on that particular point about international agencies and enforcement, and the honourable member, my friend, was mentioning the point about logging. Does she share with me a concern that at this particular time there is an opportunity for the United Nations to actually, and through CITES, to actually ensure that there are greater controls over not just the logging, but obviously the markets and the opportunity to be selling these wood products, timber products around the world, where we're seeing rosewood and teak and so on being lost for all sorts of, say, garden furniture and other products, which is really quite unnecessary in this era. And does she share the concern that I have, that through UN and CITES we should be putting an absolute stop to this, so there's no market?
Rachel Maskell.
I really do thank my honourable friend for raising the role of CITES and the UN, and I'm going to highlight some other ways I believe that we can bring pressure to bear to protect this habitat, and therefore the fact that goods can be traded, and indeed, across the agricultural sector as well, means that we've got a serious problem, because when we start seeing the label Brazil, we have got to be able to make inquiries as to where things have been sourced, like elsewhere in the world. And when I was in Shadow Minister in DEFRA, I was looking at the labelling we have on all of our products, because it's absolutely essential that our inquiring minds shouldn't just have to go and research everything that we purchase, but should be able to easily access data to understand the source. And it may make us make different consumption choices if that were the case. But of course, this isn't just another problem in another country, in a far-off continent. It is where 15% of global terrestrial photosynthesis takes place. And of course, the rainforest, we think of the lungs of our planet, and the place where we are seeing the reversing of carbon sequestered and driving climate, precipitation and weather systems. And our battle with the climate deterioration is caught up in the Amazon story, and events that happen in the UK are resultant of what is happening across the Amazon. So our actions at this time really do matter. But whether the Amazon or Borneo in Indonesia, West Africa or the US, the pace of deforestation is alarming, and actions to respond to this will provide real resistance to climate degradation. COP24 was a hopeful moment. However, we are all real enough to know that unless we see global action taken, then of course the Paris Accord will be futile. And I do not belittle the agreements like the Tropical Forest Alliance that the UK is a signature to. And I urge the government to use greater influence with these alliances for global action. Nor do I belittle the drops of money we have placed in the ocean needed to tackle the global climate catastrophe. But it is clear that the political and financial relationships of the UK and global partners also have a significant role to play. As the UK this summer launched a new trade facilitation programme with Brazil to support exports to the UK, I asked the Minister how this has specifically brought pressure on Mr Bolsonaro to change his approach. What efforts are being taken in the city, and no doubt UK pension funds and investments, to withdraw from companies exploiting the Amazon region? Where is the transparency? I will just continue for a moment. Where is the market transparency? Where are we seriously lessening the demand on products, from minerals to meat, to take away the case for destroying our rainforests?
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would she agree with me that it's actually really important that we encourage the City of London, for example, to invest in ethical funds, particularly those that are seeking to unleash the huge potential that I outlined in my speech with regards to renewable energy, particularly offshore wind, of which Brazil's coastline is just unmatched in terms of ability to produce?
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and I listened carefully to the speech that he made. And of course, across our globe, we have got so much untapped resource which we can transform our energy market, and it's really important that we look at that seriously. And as my honourable friend for Huddersfield said, the talent within Brazil to bring about that transformation, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the UK, but can come from Brazil as well, to bring transformation to the whole region. And I would agree, there are real opportunities as we look to Green New Deals we don't want to just see in the UK, but we want to see them spring up across the world. But we have got a role in playing leverage over protecting the natural resources, and or else our battle with the climate will be lost. Real climate justice must be rooted in making the connection between politics, finance and climate change. Where harm is occurring in one corner of the world, the consequences will be felt by us all, and of course the least resilient, the most. And therefore, we can't just deal with this as nation states, or even to see it as our responsibility just to have a jurisdiction over our country. These are global issues, and as internationalists, it's absolutely vital that we address them globally. We cannot afford not to apply that leverage. The cost of climate degradation to the UK, to developing countries, to global inequality, to population migration, to flood and famine is too great. The UK boasts our place in the global economic market, but unless we use our power to force change, we are simply complicit with the actions of Bolsonaro. This petition, signed by 303 of my constituents, calls for trade sanctions, one measure amongst many to pressurise the Brazilian government. I have to say that this government's response to the petition was woeful. will continue to monitor the situation in the Amazon closely. How will that help? Dialogue with Brazil. Really? We are currently part of the UN and the EU. How are we using our leverage to ensure that those responsible for not only Amazon deforestation but our wider climate crisis, and to ensure people are held to account? Paris was a landmark agreement, but with Bolsonaro wanting to withdraw and even the UK government well off target for meeting its fourth and fifth carbon budgets, it is clear that declarations are not enough. Global leverage is now needed. When atrocities are committed, we have an international process of justice in The Hague to deal with those responsible through the International Court of Justice. However, the millions who are affected by climate degradation have no such seat of justice. If we leave the EU, we will see the powers of the EU courts removed, and short of the environmental bill filling the deficit, accountability over pollution or environmental destruction will be severely weakened. The UN may pass resolutions, as valued as they are, but the leverage it places is all too weak. The likes of Bolsonaro are able to laugh at the UN, the EU and the UK unless we firstly apply a comprehensive political, trade and financial approach of sanction. But further, in the light of a climate crisis, we must seriously explore the leverage through a system of global justice to apply to those who breach global agreements, whether signature to them or not. The levels of devastation to our climate are so significant that it demands an international judicial approach, with powers to strip assets from companies who breach international agreements and political administrations who enable them to do so. We have got a role in shaping the future and leading the world in these matters. And I want to hear what the Minister will do to do that. Because I know that we cannot sit back and wait. And we need innovative solutions and harsh solutions to be able to tackle the real crisis that we're facing. I just want to end by reflecting on the climate strikes we saw and the words of one boy who spoke in York. He made his speech very short, and as he got up out of his class to go and join the climate strikers, his teacher called out to him and said, "What difference are you going to make as one person?" He walked out the room and just said back, "Let's see." Well, he spoke at that climate strike, and I spoke to him. I'm standing in this place, and now I'm speaking to the Minister. Let's see what difference that boy can make, and the thousands of young people that come out on the streets, and the people protesting from Extinction Rebellion, and the global movement which is building today. Let's see how the Minister responds. Let's hope we can really address this climate emergency and put real measures in place that will transform this serious, very serious situation today.
Matt Roder. Thank you, Mr. Gale. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I would like to also thank the range of honourable members who've spoken in favour of this motion. Particularly, I was taken by my colleague's speech, also my honourable friend for Cambridge, and the honourable member for Huddersfield as well, and indeed the honourable member for Bath. I think all spoke eloquently about the need for urgent action, and I agree wholeheartedly with their support for this motion and for the petition. Mr. Gale, I'd like to address two key points which have come through in a number of other speeches, but maybe they perhaps need some further emphasis. The first point is the scale of the challenge, and the second one is the need for urgent response. So in terms of the scale of the challenge, I think it's vital to consider where we are with climate change and to look at the term climate emergency and consider what it really means, and then to look at the potential range of responses which governments have around the world. In terms of the science of climate change, I think it's fair to say, without being any sort of expert, but a relatively informed observer, that we are approaching a serious tipping point. And I do not say that lightly. It is really clear from the evidence from the UN reports, from other independent science, from a range of universities and other scientific bodies around the world, that the climate faces a tipping point. And that isn't something which is a small tweak or a little change. It's a fundamental change. It means that we're on a path to destruction, essentially, of humanity on this planet. And that is because of the rising proportion of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere which cause or allow and facilitate climate change. And as humans, we're ultimately responsible for that process. The data is really clear. The number of warm years in the last few years, the amount of carbon dioxide that's been measured since the 1950s, the link with climate change is really clear, and indeed the other gases as well. And where we now sit is on the cusp, on the very edge, on the brink of an abyss, and we have to do something about that. I think it is perfectly reasonable and responsible, given that situation which we now face, which is shown by the melting and the threat of melting of great ice sheets, not just of relatively modest areas of ice, but of the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, which would dramatically increase the sea level around the world and which would lead to large parts of the planet being uninhabitable, including parts of Great Britain, many coastal cities in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and towns next to rivers like in my own constituency of Reading East, both in Reading and Woodley, could be very seriously affected by this level of change. Over many decades, admittedly, but it would mean that we would be saying to our children in our old age, we failed, and we failed very seriously. So in that context, I think it is perfectly reasonable for protesters outside and for us in this House to use the term climate emergency. I think we should not shy away from it, and I hope the Minister, I'm sure he will wish to address this with the level of gravity which this very serious situation demands. So that's my first point, and I'm grateful for colleagues for making those points clearly in support of that and highlighting the particular issues in Brazil with the very great importance of the Amazon and indeed in the other South American countries where it is a huge carbon sink, obviously, and it also is at threat from these dreadfully irresponsible fires which the government of Brazil has so wrongly allowed to take place. My second point, which is on a different note but addresses the first one, is the need for urgent and sustained action. And I believe it is the duty of all governments of whatever political colour around the world to join together and take that action now, and indeed of us as private individuals, of companies, of charities, of schools, whatever human organisation exists. We need to, in some way, change our behaviour, whether that's reducing the amount of meat we eat, driving less, taking a whole series of other steps, cycling rather than driving. There's a series of measures we can all take in our daily lives. And what I would say in terms of the importance of this motion is that we shouldn't shy away, as people in the developed world, from taking a very clear stance with other people in the developing world. However awkward that might seem, and I take the honourable member's points about the need to engage with civil society in Brazil, I think that's absolutely right, but we can do that also by reinforcing the voices in Brazil who are calling for change and who are addressing the deep mistakes of that government. And I do think, given that context, that this motion is absolutely and utterly right. We should take it seriously, and I hope the Minister will address it in his speech, in his words this afternoon. I'm sure he will. He'll want to take that on, I hope. I would urge him to take this very seriously and to leave no stone unturned and to consider this form of action. It is not something we should take lightly, but it is a necessary potential policy in this, given this situation. So I would urge him to address us very seriously and clearly on this matter.
Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Gill. And I'd like to begin by thanking all those who've been speaking today, each one pretty much pointing in the same direction, that action is needed, and it's needed now, and it's urgent. And I'd also like to thank those who initiated and added their signatures to this petition. I believe there's over 122,000, many hundreds of which are from my city of Dundee, and allowing us to have this important debate. And also to thank the opening speaker, the honourable member for Cambridge, for his insightful and informative speech that allowed us to get to this really good debate we've had so far. I feel it's particularly fitting that we're having this debate today, as many others have noticed in this room, as Extinction Rebellion began a 2-week protest in and around Westminster. And indeed, last Friday, I had a couple of members come to see me to discuss what they thought we should do this week in terms of being outside. And I said, the most important thing is pressurise each and every one of your MPs to speak. And I'm afraid to say, although we've got great speakers here today, this room should be ram-packed, frankly. Extinction Rebellion have been clear that human activity is causing irreparable harm to life on this planet, and as a result we're facing a global climate emergency and mass extinction. And let's remember this is happening both here at home in the UK as well as across the planet. The current situation in the Amazon is a sad illustration of this fact. The continued deforestation of the Amazon rainforest will only exacerbate the climate emergency we face and accelerate the loss of species we should be protecting. The protection of the Amazon rainforest is an issue of global importance. In simple terms, the Amazon rainforest serves as the lungs of our planet. It accounts for 15% of global terrestrial photosynthesis, absorbing huge amounts of carbon dioxide every year. At a time when we are acutely aware of the need to remove CO2 from our atmosphere, it is dangerously counterproductive to risk the future of our planet by recklessly damaging this vital global resource. Additionally, over 30 million people live in the Amazon, including between 300 and 400 Indigenous groups. And in my time after studies at university in social anthropology, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the Amazon and listen to some of the many secrets and lessons that people learn from living within the Amazon area. For many of these people, the rainforest is not just a home. It is a home of their ancestors. It defines their daily lives and is integral to their culture. These people who have lived and breathed the Amazon for generations are the most likely to suffer as their needs are overlooked and the environment is destroyed in favour of the interests of those pursuing profit and economic growth regardless of the consequences. Furthermore, the Amazon is an incredibly rich ecosystem which we have a duty to protect, with 1 in 10 known species on Earth contained in the rainforest. 1 in 10. For example, there are 40,000 plant species, 3,000 varieties of fish, and 1,300 types of birds. And the Honourable Member mentioned earlier there are medicines yet waiting to be discovered, many of which may be life-saving. All of this is under threat due to deforestation, and the simple but sad fact is that once we destroy these species, we will never get them back. We must not let this happen. It should be unthinkable that future generations will grow up without this biodiversity, one of the world's natural wonders. But without serious action, we risk losing this vital asset with devastating consequences. We have all seen the shocking images of fires in the Amazon rainforest over the summer. More than 30,000 fires were recorded in August alone. And this has prompted much of the recent discussion on deforestation. Deforestation has been a huge problem in the Amazon over the past 50 years, with 17% of the forest cover having been devastated during that period. We're all familiar with why deforestation is taking place: the expansion of extensive cattle farming and timber plantations, increase of oil, gas and mining operations, and construction of large-scale infrastructure projects such as big dams and roads. Large-scale voluntary commitments, regulatory reforms and the creation of protected areas helped result in a dramatic drop in deforestation in the Amazon between 2004 and 2012. In 2012, Brazil recorded its lowest deforestation rate in the last 20 years. Now, this would have been something to be proud of if this trend had not been reversing since then, and this is particularly troubling. Deforestation began to rise again in 2016, and the rate of damage and loss over the past 2 years is higher than it was 20 years ago. It is clear that we have not been vigilant enough in protecting our rainforests. And it appears that 2019 is going to be a particularly bad year. As we heard earlier, deforestation rates in June 2019 were 88% higher compared to the same month the previous year. According to preliminary satellite data, the losses for the first 7 months of 2019 are 16% higher than the recent high of 3,183 square kilometres lost in 2016. We are witnessing disaster unfold before our eyes. What is most troubling in all of this is the attitude taken by some, in particular the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. We know that he is sceptical of actions to curb climate change and wanted to pull Brazil out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. He has spoken of the Amazon as a virgin that should be exploited for agriculture, mining and infrastructure projects. When Brazil's Institute for Space Research revealed the extent of deforestation this summer, he said the numbers were fake, dismissed international concerns as sensationalist, and sacked the head of the institute. Bolsonaro's stripping back of protections and anti-environmental rhetoric has clearly encouraged those who wish to see deforestation of the Amazon for their own gain. Worryingly, this appears to become something of a global pattern, with Bolsonaro following in the climate change-denying, anti-environmental footsteps of President Trump. Each president that scorns the need to protect the environment undermines the Paris Agreement and is willing to sacrifice precious resources, which will only embolden the next populist leader elsewhere intent on dismissing the scientific evidence that we have in front of us. It turns our back on collective responsibility and refuses to take on the environmental challenge that we are all faced with, in favour of furthering their own short-term, narrow interests, regardless of the consequences. We therefore must have a means to fight back against these attitudes and actions. While trade wars are no one's best interest, we must keep every option open to combat deforestation and the climate emergency. My SNP colleague in the European Parliament, Alan Smith, has joined with other MEPs across the Member States to write to the European Commission, urging it to make implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change a precondition for any country wanting to conclude a trade agreement with the European Union. Additionally, Ira Chisek and France's president have said that they will attempt to block the Mercosur trade agreement if Brazil continues to ignore its environmental commitments. The UK government should seriously listen to these words. It cannot continue with business as usual while Bolsonaro presides over the destruction of the Amazon. The deforestation of the Amazon is a global issue which requires a global response. It is evident that economic development will always trump environmental protection in the eyes of Brazil's current president, and the UK cannot indulge and seek to benefit from Bolsonaro's desire for growth and trade where the Amazon rainforest is sacrificed. Therefore, in any future trade talks with Brazil, what provisions will be made to disincentivise deforestation and to ensure that goods originating from illegally cleared land in the Amazon do not form part of any trade deal and find a way into the UK? We need to hear crystal clear from the Minister about the UK Government's plans on this today. Furthermore, it's imperative that we act not only as defenders of the environment, but as the defenders of human rights. Bolsonaro stated that, and I quote, "Not a centimetre more of land would be demarcated for Indigenous and transferred responsibility for delineating Indigenous territories from the Justice Ministry to the Agricultural Ministry." Chair, that means you're putting people in amongst cattle as if they're one and the same thing. This was seen by many as concession to the agriculture industry and an expression of his desire to pursue the expansion of agriculture at the expense of the rights of Indigenous people. One lawmaker described it as, and I quote, "letting the fox take over the chicken coop." Ensuring the territorial rights of Indigenous peoples is an urgent and essential imperative. So I ask the Minister, what efforts are the UK Government making to ensure that their rights are protected? The protection of the Amazon is an issue that cuts across foreign policy, trade policy and international development policy, and there must be coherence across these different government departments and how the UK tackles the ongoing problem of Amazon deforestation and global climate change and environmental degradation more generally. And as we know, policy coherence across the UK Government has been left wanting. Therefore, what steps are being taken to ensure policy coherence to tackle this hugely important problem in the short and medium term? I'd like to conclude by saying, throughout this debate, I've been reminded of the passionate words of Greta Thunberg at the UN last month, where she said, "People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth." Nothing exemplifies this more, Chair, than the deforestation of the Amazon. It is one of the great tragedies of our time, and we must do everything we possibly can to stop this from spiralling out of control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Roger. It's very nice to see you in the chair this evening. I'd like to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, on his excellent and comprehensive introduction to this debate. And I also, of course, am very grateful to the people who initiated the petition and all the people who have signed it, because this is a crucial problem for us all. And as other colleagues have said, it's very appropriate that we're debating this while Extinction Rebellion are demonstrating outside. And I have to say, I find it absolutely incredible that some people seem to think that the big problem is that Westminster Bridge is blocked. The big problem is that the Amazon has been on fire, and we need to get these things into proportion. The Amazon fires over the summer, which were lit by people, they weren't accidental natural fires, Sir Roger, they were lit by people, deliberately destroyed 7,000 square miles of forest. And the reason this is particularly worrying is because once a large amount of forest is destroyed, we then get feedback mechanisms and we will not be able to control what goes on. This is one of the most important feedback mechanisms that we need to avoid, because the Amazon rainforest every year absorbs a quarter of the carbon dioxide which is emitted across the whole world. Now, what that tells us is that fires in the Amazon are not a Brazilian problem. They're not a Latin American problem. They're our problem. They are everybody's problem. We need to own it and we need to tackle it in that spirit. And I am disappointed with the way the government has this tiptoeing approach, which suggests to me that they don't really understand the seriousness of the problem. And I don't know why government ministers don't understand it, because my constituents understand it. Di Murphy, who set up Bishop Auckland Climate Action, she understands it. Even 10-year-old Meredith Lambert-Sams, who invited me to her school, her primary school last week, she understands it. I went to Cutherston Primary School on Friday, and I was asked a lot of questions, and they were extremely well-informed children. But the most worrying question came from a boy who said to me, "What I don't understand is why proper action hasn't been taken already." And I have to say, I was quite stumped by that question, because it's not as if we haven't known for 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. How bad does it have to get before we take proper action? There is absolutely no longer any room for complacency whatsoever. We only have 12 years now. We have got to sort this out. Of course, we're really concerned about the Amazon because of the impact on the climate, and I do think that is the priority. But I would just like to remind people of the biodiversity in the Amazon, because we're inhabiting this globe not alone, but alongside others. It's one of the Earth's last refuges for jaguars, for harpy eagles, for pink dolphins, for two-toed sloths, for pygmy marmosets, for saddleback and emperor tamarins and Goldie's monkeys. There are thousands of birds and butterflies and other insects. And when we think about looking after the planet, we have to do it not just for ourselves, but for all the marvellous flourishing of biodiversity which there is at the moment. I'm disappointed that the Honourable Member for Fylde has left, because he said that he was very concerned that we should not be implementing trade sanctions, because we should have a more collaborative approach with the Indigenous people. I think he hasn't read the petition, because what the petition says is Indigenous people have called for the EU to impose trade sanctions on Brazil to halt the deforestation because they fear genocide. So the Indigenous people have been living in a sustainable way in the Amazon for generations, and of course the Honourable Member for Winchester is right that with modern science we can use the resources of the Amazon in new and creative ways, particularly in medicine. But I think we need to be very careful about behaving as if we're the experts and the Indigenous people don't know what they're up to, because it's clear that their way of life was not destroying the Amazon in the way that our way of life has been. And I think my honourable friend, the member for Bristol, made an excellent speech about the exploitation of the forests and the urgent need for us to cut our meat consumption. Now, when she and I were first discussing this 3 years ago, I thought she was being a bit zany, but I have been totally persuaded that she has a really strong case, and we do need to think about this, and we need to act on this as individuals and as a nation. Because what we need to do really is we need to move from talking about it to taking action. And there are some actions that I think are particularly pertinent here. Now, the petition calls for trade sanctions, and we've had quite a lot of debate about whether or not we need to collaborate or have trade sanctions. I'm not sure that I think this is necessarily a choice. I mean, if we take another but connected area of public policy, Of course, we put money into the universities to finance R&D, but we also have laws to protect people's intellectual property. So we can have a both-and approach. We can collaborate, but we need to have sanctions when things go wrong. And like my honourable friend, the member for Bristol, I want to refer to a debate which I initiated a few years ago in a speech that I made at that time, because we had a debate before the Paris summit. It was a backbench business committee debate in the main chamber. And everybody was saying, oh, it's all going to be absolutely marvellous because everybody's going to turn up and they're going to volunteer their contributions and that's the way to get everybody on board and you'll be absolutely marvellous. And I'm afraid I stood up and people thought I was zany then and I said, this is no good because these commitments are not legally binding. And if they're not legally binding, how can we be confident that we're going to meet the targets that we have to meet? We need to, the science is not going to change. We know how much carbon we must not burn. Therefore, we need to make commitments that will achieve the scientific objective, and they need to be legally binding. Now, what being legally binding means is that there's a penalty if countries don't abide by them. And I think that we should think about other areas of international law where we do have penalties when countries don't fulfil their obligations. And we should borrow our experience from other areas of international law and adapt isn't the right word, and use them in the area of the environment. And I'll give an example. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we took sanctions. We were appalled by this. We all thought this is absolutely dreadful. But when Canada left Kyoto, we took no action whatsoever. Now, Bolsonaro is behaving in an utterly irresponsible way, as honourable members have set out. We're proposing to take no action. This is not serious. We need to get serious about this. We need to have legally binding international agreements. So one of my asks of the Minister is that when ministers go to Chile for the next round of the international negotiations and they're looking at what the format and the structure should be, we need to have a proper, clear legal base. We need to move away from voluntarism towards legally binding treaties. The other thing is, as other colleagues have said, the danger in this Mercosur deal is that if we cut tariffs on beef, we incentivise the destruction of the rainforest by the Brazilians and the other Latin American countries, and then we become complicit in the destruction of the forest. Now, I raised this with the Minister in the chamber at Foreign Office Questions, and he said to me, well, he didn't think that I was right about this because he thought that cutting tariffs was good for the poorest people and the poorest, most low-income farmers in Brazil. Now, I'm afraid I don't believe that, because what we see here is the indigenous people, and they are the poorest people, wanting tougher action. And what we also see is the large agribusinesses and the international multinationals making the profits when we do have this large-scale ranching. So I really think he needs to rethink that. We need to line up with the French and the Irish and the other countries and say, no, a trade deal must be done on the basis that it is consistent with Brazil's... Yeah.
A very passionate, a really great speech. And according to the sort of figures that I've seen, according to the International Labour Organization, some 62% of slave labour in Brazil is employed in livestock farming-related businesses. So that is, as you say, it's not the indigenous people that are benefiting from this trade. It's actually people that are being grossly exploited, that are, that are at the heart of it.
Yes, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and she brings me onto my next action. Because the fact of the matter is, and we see this all across the globe, you often have environmental destruction and human rights abuses in the same places going on, all jumbled up at the same time. And we're seeing this here as well. And it's one of the reasons why I also hope that the government will take a more sympathetic view than it is currently to the negotiations which are ongoing in Geneva on the UN binding treaty on transnational cooperation and human rights, because that would put obligations on the transnational corporations to respect human rights, and we could extend that to respecting environmental rights as well. So I think the priority at the moment is not to sign a trade deal that will incentivise further destruction of the rainforest. That's the number one priority, but there are a range of things the Minister could do. And as well as us discussing this here, of course, the Pope is holding an Amazon Synod in Rome. And I was very struck by what he said when he opened this on Saturday. And I think this is very appropriate, and I think it sets in context what the problem is. He's also got 400 groups from 400 Indigenous communities in Rome alongside him. He said, what we have to stop is the greed of new forms of colonialism. Thank you very much, Roger.
Minister.
Well, Sir Roger, it's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to attend this debate. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Cambridge on securing it. And indeed, I congratulate all Honourable Members who have contributed for what they have said. It may be, Sir Roger, that we disagree with some of the solutions, but I don't think anybody will disagree with the passion and the expertise that has been brought into this chamber today. I will try to address as many of the points that have been raised by honourable members as I possibly can. But could I, to begin with, just draw out 2 points. The first relates to something that the honourable member for Bristol East said. I thought that she made some very interesting diversification initiatives, and I'm very happy to talk to her about some of those. When I, Sir Roger, was on the Energy and Climate Change Select Committee in the 2010-2015 Parliament, I remember we looked at the question of how best to increase awareness and how best to change choices which can drive carbon emissions. And we looked at whether it's possible to measure carbon emissions by production or whether it is better to do it by consumption. And consumption is an issue which has been raised around the chamber today. The finding of the committee at that time was that to go down the route of measuring carbon emissions by consumption and imposing penalties or sanctions or modelling policy around that approach was that you might well risk trade conflict, which wouldn't just hurt those people who are consuming the goods, possibly in the West, but those people who are producing them in low-wage developing economies. That was the view at the time. I was also struck by the speech of my honourable friend, and I call him a friend, the member for Winchester, and his rather sad story of his poetic limitations. In fact, I thought he'd gone away a moment ago to write yet another poem. He made reference to what our policy will be in the future. I think a veiled reference to Mercosur and our attitude to it, as did the honourable member for Dundee West and indeed the honourable lady for Bishop Auckland. Mercosur will not be signed, I think, any time soon, Sir Roger. By the time it is, we will be out of the European Union, and it won't be a trade agreement for us to sign. We will be free to develop and model our own trading agreements and arrangements, and how they look, what they feel like and smell like will be a matter for the British government. And whether there are environmental elements in those trade deals is still to be determined. But what I do believe, and there again I take issue with the Honourable Lady, when you impose tariffs or do not remove tariffs, then you hurt poor people. Tariffs on food tend to hurt the poorest, and so I would support a a wide-ranging free trading policy, and I discourage her from sort of channeling her inner protectionist and pursuing a policy which I think would hurt everybody, including her constituents and Indigenous communities in the rainforest.
Will the Minister allow?
I've only just begun. I haven't even got onto the speech proper, rather like the member for Cambridge, but yes, I will.
See, Brian, so I thank you for addressing my point, and I won't say this in prose, but obviously we will be therefore outside of being a member state, and that trade deal will be signed by the remaining members of the European Union, but were this government to consider a trade deal with Brazil in the future, would the Minister agree that their approach to tackling climate change should be a consideration that would be discussed by his colleagues across the Department for International Trade? Minister.
I'm grateful, Sir Roger, to my honourable friend for his intervention. He said he won't speak in prose. I will speak in plain verse. It is for Britain to decide what its trade policy and the models it applies in free trade agreements will be. That is a future decision for the government to take. I'm sure there will be debate on the matter across the House and through government. I will give way on that point, and then I really am going to get into the speech. Otherwise, we will be here until 7:30.
I thank the Minister, because it is specifically on that point, and he will know, as will others in this chamber, that there has been a trade bill sat on the shelf waiting for over a year, that I sat in on the Trade Bill Committee. And that included, for certain protections, certain measures, certain bodies to actually have some say in how we should be constructing our trade deals, whether it be on an ethical basis or whether it be through the bodies such as the Trade Remedies body, and that these sorts of things would have come into play. The concern that I think most people will have in this chamber, but also in Parliament and across the country, is those sorts of protections are not going to be available because the trade bill will no longer exist.
Assuming that prorogation takes place tomorrow, then the honourable member is right. But there will be a trade bill or trade bills in the future, and I'm sure those issues can then be readdressed. Sir Roger, the fires that ravaged the Amazon rainforest over the summer were not only heartbreaking for the people in the region, and we've heard some of the stories this afternoon, they were a concern and are a concern to all of us who care about biodiversity and climate. In some places, this devastating surge in fires follows a sharp rise in rates of deforestation this year, although I think has been pointed out already, deforestation has been on the increase. Not, I think, since 2015, which is what I said in the chamber, I must correct the record, but since 2012, which predates, of course, the Bolsonaro government. And it is clear that although the recent fires may have been exacerbated by low rainfall, and in some cases strong winds, a key cause remains the use of fire to clear the rainforest for agriculture. In Brazil, record numbers of fires, as we've heard, have occurred during this year's dry season, prompting the international concern that we have all seen. And that has prompted President Bolsonaro to send more than 40,000 military personnel to the Amazon to bring the fires under control. But the effect of that remains unclear. It's also worth pointing out, and my honourable friend, the member for, I think, Bedford South East alluded to it, that Bolivia has suffered a similar fate this summer. Fires since August have destroyed nearly 2 million hectares of Bolivian forest, and that includes the Chiquitania, the largest dry forest on Earth. In response, President Morales and opposition parties suspended campaigning activities for their October presidential elections, whilst the government set up an emergency environmental cabinet in the affected area. Europe, the United States, Russia and Bolivia's neighbours have provided the most help to bring the fires under control, whilst British experts were among the first to be deployed to offer assistance. Rains in the last week have begun to extinguish the fires. And I mention Bolivia simply to remind all honourable members that the problem isn't simply a Brazilian one, and therefore we cannot lay the cause, the culprit, at the door of the Brazilian government and president. There are other reasons for the problems that the rainforest is facing. So whilst we respect absolutely the sovereignty of countries of the region over the rainforest, that sovereignty comes with a responsibility to protect and preserve this precious resource. And whilst it's regrettable that some governments initially sought to play down the extent of the problem, we welcome the current and historic leadership shown by the region to address the fires. For example, the creation of the forest codes in Brazil, which legally requires landowners in the Brazilian Amazon to maintain 80% of the land as forest. It's worth also pointing out that on the 27th of August, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, spoke to the Brazilian Foreign Minister, who made clear that anyone setting fires in the rainforest will be prosecuted, that in fact prosecutions are underway, and the penalties for such fires include imprisonment. Moreover, last month, the regional summit hosted by President Duque of Colombia, where 7 regional leaders signed the Leticia Pact for the Amazon. Now, this pact, leaders have pledged to improve coordination to prevent and manage forest fires, share best practice, and develop initiatives to accelerate reforestation and build sustainable forest economies. We fully support this regionally led initiative, and we stand ready to help. The United Kingdom government is committed to working with Amazon countries to support efforts to protect and restore the Amazon rainforest. Over many years, we have partnered with communities, businesses, state and national governments in Brazil and in the wider Amazon region, Sir Roger, to preserve and restore rainforests for the benefit of people, of nature, and our collective effort to tackle the threat of climate change. Since 2012, a point again I think I made in the chamber at Foreign Office OPQs, the United Kingdom government has committed £120 million in international climate finance programmes operating to reduce deforestation in Brazil, and a further £70 million in Colombia. I think that suggests that we're doing a lot more than nothing, because this investment is generating benefits for the local environment, local communities, and for the global climate. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, rather helpfully trailed by the honourable member for Cambridge, at the G7, pledged a further £10 million for our international climate finance work to support the longer-term efforts to tackle deforestation in Brazil. And that will expand the existing programme, which is supporting the protection and restoration of Brazil's rainforests, including areas which have been affected by recent fires. I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way on that point. It's interesting hearing him tiptoe around some of the issues in this important debate. I wanted to ask him really whether he felt £10 million, given the scale of the challenge that we face across the world, is really enough money to deploy in this important issue.
Well, So, Roger, I'll point out that we're spending £120 million, not £10 million. And if he'll forgive me, because he's getting a little ahead of me, I'll mention some other rather larger figures as my speech develops. It is important that we build an international coalition to build around our ambition. That is why we're working with Germany, why we're working with Norway to mobilise $5 billion US dollars, there's the big number, between 2015 and 2020 to help reduce tropical deforestation in developing countries. Our support is helping to improve the capacity of national and regional governments to reduce deforestation. It's incentivising the protection of forests, it's conserving a way of life for many unique Indigenous groups, and enabling businesses and communities to build sustainable economies without destroying tropical rainforests, as my honourable friend, the member for Fylde, rather eloquently, I think, described his experience. And I believe he's now gone off to a delegated legislation committee, Sir Roger, which is why he is not here for the wind-ups. For example, one of our programmes supports Indigenous Brazil nut collectors to cut out the middleman and sell directly to mainstream buyers. Perhaps that's not such a difficult nut to crack, but if you'll forgive me, I will just finish and then I will give way to her. Furthermore, as a result of our Chiredo programme in Brazil, 38,117 farmers were enrolled onto the Rural Land Registry, and that represents something like 861,000 hectares of land where sustainable practices have now been adopted. I'll give way.
I thank him for giving way. Does he really believe the young impatient people out there and the older impatient people will actually find this a satisfactory answer to all the things that we've just heard about this year being the most devastating year for deforestation in the Amazon? The government really needs to do better. Does he really think the people out there who've been campaigning and will campaign for the next 2 years will be satisfied with what he's just been saying?
Minister. Well, Sir Roger, I don't doubt for a moment the sincerity of the people out on the streets of London campaigning about the impact of climate change. I would say to her, it is better for us to work with economies like Brazil, the 9th largest economy in the world, rather than work against them in order to achieve the objectives we all want, which is to see carbon emissions reduced, the rainforest restored, and the poorest people get richer. The United Kingdom is leading the world in the fight against rising temperatures, reducing our emissions by over 40% since 1990 and legislating for net zero emissions by 2050. If she bears with me, I'll give way in a moment. We were one of the first major economies to do so. And in that time, since 1990, our economy has grown by 66%. So I disagree with those who suggest that somehow there is a conflict between better trade, growth in economies, and environmental concerns and calls for action. I give way to the...
Can I ask the Minister how this works in terms of cooperation between government departments? So I asked the Secretary of State for Bays about this issue the other day in the Chamber, and she basically said it was an issue for the sort of things that I highlighted in my speech today. She said that that's an issue for DEFRA, it's not anything to do with her. And I said, well, it is, because it's climate change, that's your brief. And we also hear reports of ministers for Department of International Trade lobbying on behalf of BP at meetings in Brazil. And on the other hand, we're talking about reducing our fossil fuel use in this country. So it seems to me that there's not very much joined up working.
Well, that can be a charge levelled at governments of all stripes down the ages. I think government departments work together to try to achieve the right result in this particular arena. For example, at COP25, BEIS officials are embedded in that particular plan and in that particular meeting in order to ensure that when it's handed over to us at COP26, there is a smooth handover with objectives that can then be taken up in the Italian-British COP. But we can't tackle this threat to our very existence on our own, as I think we've all alluded to today. It's only through international cooperation that we can protect our precious planet and protect forests, which are essential if we're to meet our global climate change goals. The IPCC Special Report on Global Warming makes clear that the preservation, restoration and sustainable management of forests is critical for limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Our global leadership on climate change helped us to win our bid to host COP26 next year. We will only make telling progress toward carbon neutral growth if we act together as a global community, which means we need to have all the countries in the Amazon on side. Now, Brazil is particularly important on climate change and deforestation, and it has as a partner a critical role to play. We must work together to find solutions, which is why we have an ongoing dialogue with them on these issues at ministerial and official level. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, met last week with Brazil's Environment Minister, Ricardo Salles, and she stressed the importance of efforts to halt deforestation. The Foreign Secretary has spoken to the Brazilian Foreign Minister. I have met the Brazilian Ambassador, Mr. Arruda. We are committed to working with Brazil and other Amazon countries to tackle climate change and deforestation. Because we care deeply. I'll give way.
I'm listening carefully to the Minister's speech, and whilst I'm hearing the diplomatic channels which the government are wanting to pursue to influence Brazil's position in its response to deforestation, could the Minister set out exactly what sanction or what leverage it will apply? Because it seems to me that if talk isn't enough and Brazil determined to do something different, then this exercise is quite futile.
Minister. Sir Roger, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her intervention, but I just don't think that talk of sanctions is going to help in this particular cause. I do not think that threatening Brazil is going to encourage President Bolsonaro or his government to talk with us about how we can collaboratively tackle this problem. It is better that we engage sensitively and sensibly rather than engaging in megaphone diplomacy from afar, because we all care deeply about the future of our planet, and we are determined that COP26 will deliver a greater ambition. It will promote tangible action to deliver the transformational changes required by the Paris Agreement. We're working closely with Chile to ensure a smooth handover from COP25, as I described earlier on, and we firmly support their desire for an ambitious blue COP25 with a strong focus on oceans. We remain committed to supporting the countries of the Amazon to tackle deforestation. And these countries, as I've said, will be vital allies in the fight against climate change. Brazil, particularly as home to 60% of the Amazon and 12% of the world's forests, has, as I have said before, and I'll say it again now, a crucial role to play if we're to achieve our climate ambitions at COP26 and beyond. If future climate negotiations are to be successful, we need to engage with Brazil and her neighbours positively and maintain a constructive dialogue, not shout at them from afar. At the same time, the United Kingdom government will continue to raise our concerns about deforestation and will continue to support initiatives that protect the Amazon rainforest. Because, Sir Roger, it's only through partnership and dialogue that we'll be able to preserve those precious tropical forests and avert the gravest forecasts of climate change. That, I think, is the responsible approach to take. I think it's the approach which will actually address the passions of the people outside this chamber as well as within it, and it is the approach the government is determined to take.
Thank you. Daniel Zeichner to wind up the debate, please.
Thanks, Roger, and thank you for your chairing of this debate. We have had a full debate. We've, I think, heard from 5 political parties during the course of it. And for much of the debate, I was much enthused and encouraged because it seemed to me there was a lot of common ground. And some of the difficult issues, the thorny issues around issues like sovereignty, were raised by a number of people, Honourable Member for Bath, the Honourable Member for Winchester. And I think the conclusion that was emerging was that this is a global crisis, a global responsibility, and we all have a role to play within it. And both the front bench spokespeople made powerful speeches with which I strongly agreed. I was waiting, therefore, and hoping that I would hear a positive response from the Minister, a civilised and courteous response, but I have to say in policy terms, for me, and I suspect for others, profoundly disappointing, not least because when invited to suggest that in future trade deals, environmental considerations would be a key part, on that, I'm afraid, there was a stunning silence, only that there will be trade deals. Well, they won't be very quick, we know that for sure. And what we do know is that there is an urgency about everything. And also I heard not a suggestion of criticism of the Brazilian government at the moment, which I don't think is really a very hard thing to do, given the current Brazilian government's record. Now, of course, they will be watching this debate. They will hear what we say, and it's important that we are measured and constructive in our contributions. But it's also got to be the case that we say very clearly to people on the global stage who are doing damage to our climate and our planet that that is not going to go unchallenged. And at the moment, frankly, I am deeply, deeply disappointed, Sir Roger, as I am sure the petitioners who signed this petition and the people outside, to hear that our government is so weak in its response. And I have to say the conclusion I've come to, Sir Roger, is that this government is not part of the solution. Frankly, it's part of the problem.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 266638 relating to deforestation in the Amazon. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.